London in the spring of 1812 glittered beneath the soft haze of lamplight, its cobbled streets damp from an evening shower, and its townhouses bright with expectation. Within the Ravenshire assembly rooms, the first grand ball of the season was in full bloom. Music drifted like perfume through the air, and laughter rose in bright ripples from the crowded floor. Silken gowns swept past, white gloves gleamed, and every mother in attendance measured hope by the number of dances promised to her daughters. At the edge of that brilliance stood Clara Everley, daughter of Baron Everley, a quiet woman of 27 years. Her gown was a shade of pale lilac that softened her figure but called little attention. She held a folded fan in her gloved hands and watched the whirling couples with composed detachment. To the assembly, she was one of those women whose presence neither startled nor offends, a pleasant ghost among the living, polite, mild, and already forgotten. Her sisters, however, shone brightly. Lady Marianne Barton, newly married to a wealthy lord, and Lady Charlotte Waverley, soon to wed another, moved gracefully through the crowd. Their laughter carried easily over the violins, as light as spun sugar. Clara watched them with quiet pride. It was she who had sold her mother's jewels and surrendered her own dowry so that they might enjoy the seasons that London demanded. They called her generous, others called her resigned. Either way, she had made her choice, and it had cost her all the prospects that a woman of her birth might have claimed. From behind her came a voice deep, measured, carrying a note of dry curiosity. "Do you never tire of watching other people's happiness, Miss Everley?" Clara turned. The speaker was a man she did not know. He stood a little apart from the throng, tall and impeccably dressed, though without ornament. His features were sharply cut, his eyes a shade of grey, so clear they seemed to hold no warmth at all. "I am content to observe," she replied, steady but polite. "One learns a great deal by doing so." "Indeed," he said, "you see more than most. Few here are capable of stillness." The corner of his mouth curved faintly, not quite into a smile. He seemed about to continue, but at that moment the herald's voice rang out above the hum of conversation. "His Grace, the Duke of Westmere." A stir passed through the crowd like wind across tall grass. Heads turned, whispers followed, and a wave of expectation rippled outward. Clara glanced toward the entrance and froze. The man who had spoken to her stood there, now acknowledged by all as the newly arrived guest of honor. Nathaniel Ashford, Duke of Westmere, the most private and enigmatic nobleman in London. She had heard of him, of course. Everyone had. Once engaged to the beautiful Lady Eliza Fairmont, whose tragic death by drowning 3 years earlier had left whispers of scandal in its wake, the Duke had since lived in near seclusion. That he should appear at a public assembly at all was cause for astonishment. Their eyes met briefly before he turned to greet a cluster of eager hosts. It was a look that seemed to pause time, not affection, not recognition, only an acknowledgement that she existed in the same world of light and shadow that he did. Then he was gone, absorbed by the demands of courtesy, leaving Clara uncertain whether she had imagined the moment. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur. She danced once, declined twice, and smiled through conversations she would never remember. When she returned home to the Everley townhouse, the scent of damp coal and old paper greeted her in the hall. The house, once fashionable, now bore the weary dignity of a family living beyond its means. Her father sat in the library, surrounded by ledgers, a half-empty decanter at his elbow. "You are home late, my dear," he said without looking up. "The ball continued longer than expected," she answered. "It was well attended." "And so, I am glad one of us can still enjoy such things," he muttered. His voice carried the brittle edge of worry. Clara stepped closer. "Father, are the rumors true about your investments in Wales?" He waved a trembling hand. "Rumors? Nonsense. Temporary losses, nothing more. Do not trouble yourself." But she saw the truth written in the ink-stained papers, numbers that did not balance, names of creditors she recognized from whispered gossip. The Everley fortune had been crumbling for years. This time there might be nothing left to salvage. She wished to comfort him, yet the words would not come. Her sacrifices had bought time, not salvation. If ruin came, there would be no inheritance, no position, no safety, only the quiet dignity of a family name too proud to beg. The next morning dawned grey and uncertain. Clara was in the breakfast room when the butler entered, his expression uneasy. "Miss Everley, a gentleman has arrived. He requests an immediate audience with the Baron." "His name?" "His Grace, the Duke of Westmere." The china cup nearly slipped from her fingers. "The Duke of Westmere?" she repeated softly. "Yes, miss. He insists the matter is urgent." Within minutes, She heard voices from her father's study, one pleading, the other steady and calm. "I assure you, Your Grace, the situation will resolve itself soon." "I am certain it will not," Nathaniel's voice interrupted, quiet yet immovable. "That is why I have come. This concerns not only your affairs but my own." Clara stood outside the door, her hand on the handle, every instinct telling her to remain unseen. "I propose," Nathaniel continued, "an arrangement that will protect both our names." There was silence, heavy and strange. Then her father stammered, "An arrangement?" "A marriage," the Duke said simply. Clara's breath caught. She could not see him, yet she could picture the calm resolve in his face, the same composure he had worn the night before. Through the half-open door, his gaze lifted and found her standing there. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. The Duke of Westmere regarded her not as an intruder, but as the subject of his next sentence. "With your permission, Baron, I would speak to Miss Everly herself." It was the beginning of everything that would follow. The air inside the Everly Library was cool and still. Dust motes drifted through the slanting light that fell across the great oak desk where Baron Everly sat, his face pale from sleepless nights. Opposite him, the Duke of Westmere stood with his gloved hands loosely clasped behind his back, the picture of calm restraint. At the doorway, Clara hesitated. The faint sound of her own heartbeat filled her ears as her father beckoned her forward with a trembling hand. "My dear," he said, forcing a brittle smile, "His Grace wishes to speak with you directly, a most unexpected honor." Clara stepped closer, her chin lifted though she felt the blood rush to her face. The Duke inclined his head slightly, his gaze steady and unreadable. "Miss Everly," he began, "you may think my presence abrupt, but the matter at hand admits no delay." "Kaim, I understand," she said quietly. He regarded her in silence for a long moment, as if measuring her composure. "Your father's recent difficulties are no secret," he said at last, his voice even but not unkind. "I am aware of his debts, and of the gossip already stirring among those who would delight in a scandal." Her father made a sound of protest, but the Duke raised one hand to forestall it. "I do not say this to wound, only to explain why I am here." He turned his eyes back to Clara. "My name, too, is not untouched by rumor. You may have heard of the tragedy that ended my former engagement. Since that time, I have found solitude preferable to society, yet a man cannot remain apart forever, not when duty demands otherwise." Clara folded her hands tightly. "You mean to marry again, Your Grace?" "I mean," he replied, "to propose a union that serves us both. I require a wife of integrity and discretion, someone who values order above ostentation. I have observed you, Miss Everly, and I believe you possess those qualities. In return, your family's reputation and obligations would be secured." The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water. Clara's throat tightened. "You have observed me? At last night's assembly," he said simply, "you stood apart. You neither sought attention nor feared its absence. That is a rare strength." Her father leaned forward eagerly. "Clara, do you hear what His Grace offers? This could restore everything, our home, our name." She silenced him with a gentle motion of her hand. Her gaze remained on Nathaniel Ashford. "You speak plainly, Your Grace. I cannot pretend your proposal is not startling." "I should hope it is," he said. "I have no wish to flatter or deceive. Ours would not be a union of passion, but of understanding. I ask for honesty, not affection. I offer respect and protection, nothing more." Coding. Clara's heart beat so hard she thought he must hear it. Marriage had always seemed to her a distant, gentle thing, wrapped in the vague promise of affection. Yet this was something else entirely, an exchange of duty, an agreement between two weary souls. She met his eyes. "And if I refuse? Then nothing further will pass between us," he said. "But I fear the cost of refusal will fall not upon you alone. Your father's creditors are less patient than I am." Her father made a broken sound. "Clara, for heaven's sake." "Please, father," she interrupted softly. "Let me think." Nathaniel inclined his head. "You may have until tomorrow. I will return at noon for your answer." He bowed to her and left the room with quiet steps. When the door closed, her father turned to her, his expression raw with desperation. "Clara, my dear girl, you must see what this means. A duchess, by heaven, a duchess. The family saved, every debt erased." "Saved," she repeated softly. The word felt hollow. "At what price, father?" He seized her hands. "At the price of duty, the same duty you have shown all your life. You have always sacrificed for us. This is but one more act of courage." When he released her, she walked to the window. The street outside lay bathed in grey light, A carriage passing, children shouting faintly in the distance. Beyond the glass, the world moved on, indifferent to her choices. She whispered to herself, one more act of courage. That night, she did not sleep. She sat by the dying fire, her mother's portrait propped against the mantel. The gentle eyes in the painting seemed to watch her with quiet sympathy. Would you have done the same? Clara asked aloud. Would you have traded peace for honor? The silence that followed was answer enough. When dawn touched the window panes, she rose, weary but resolved. The servants had barely begun their duties when the sound of carriage wheels echoed along the street. The butler opened the door, and Nathaniel entered once more, immaculate as before. He did not sit. Miss Everly, he said, have you come to a decision? She met his gaze. I have. Her voice was calm, though her heart trembled. If my acceptance will spare my father disgrace, then I accept. But I ask one thing of you, your grace, that we speak always with honesty. I can endure the absence of affection, but not falsehood. A shadow passed through his expression, something almost like respect. Truth, he said, is all I have left to give. He reached into his coat and drew out a small velvet box. Inside lay a ring of emeralds surrounded by delicate diamonds. This belonged to my mother. I would have you wear it. Her breath caught. The jewels glittered softly in the morning light. When he slid the ring onto her finger, his hand brushed hers, an accidental contact, brief but charged with unspoken meaning. Then it is settled, he said. The announcement will be made this week. Our wedding shall take place before the month's end. Clara inclined her head. As you wish. He bowed and departed with measured grace. When the sound of the carriage faded, she stood alone in the quiet room, staring at the ring that sparkled like a promise she did not fully understand. Outside, the bells of St. James's began to chime the hour. Clara listened to them with a strange calm. The choice had been made. Her path had narrowed to one clear line. She had saved her family once more, but for the first time, she wondered whether she could also save herself. The day of the wedding dawned pale and cool, the kind of morning when the sun seemed reluctant to rise. A faint mist clung to the rooftops of London, softening the sharp lines of the chimneys and turning the streets into rivers of silver light. Clara dressed in silence, her maid fastening the modest gown of ivory satin that Nathaniel's housekeeper had arranged. It was beautiful in its simplicity. No lace, no jewels, only a small sprig of white rose pinned near her heart. Downstairs her father waited, his expression torn between pride and guilt. You are the very image of your mother, he said softly, though the words trembled with emotion. Clara smiled, faint but genuine. Let us hope I may have her courage then. L'Uestri. At the small chapel of St. Martin's, only a handful of witnesses gathered. There were no crowds, no glittering guests. The Duke had insisted upon discretion, and Clara was grateful for it. The ceremony passed as swiftly as a breath. The vicar's voice echoed gently through the still air, as vows were exchanged, words that bound but did not comfort. I, Nathaniel Ashford, take thee, Clara Everly. Her own voice followed, steady though her heart faltered. I, Clara Everly, take thee, Nathaniel Ashford. When it was done, he slipped a simple gold band beside the emerald ring that already marked her promise. His touch was cool, precise, respectful. There was no kiss upon the altar, only a bow and a murmur of gratitude to the vicar. Outside the chapel, a carriage awaited. London moved quietly around them, the hum of wheels and distant bells blending into one low, endless note. As they stepped inside, Nathaniel offered his hand. She placed hers in his without hesitation, and yet the moment felt less like joining than parting. For a time neither spoke. The city fell away behind them, its spires fading into the morning haze. Through the window, Clara watched the landscape unfold, fields wet with dew, hedgerows heavy with blossom, the occasional thatched cottage rising like a dream from the green. It was beautiful, and yet she felt strangely detached from it, as though she were watching the world through glass. Nathaniel sat opposite, his posture perfectly straight, his eyes fixed upon the passing road. The stillness between them grew heavy, but not unpleasant. It was the stillness of two people who understood that silence could be safer than words. At last he spoke. I trust the ceremony was not too austere for your taste. I found it peaceful, she said. Peace is something I have long valued. A faint smile touched his lips. Then we begin with one virtue already shared. Quote, the rhythm of the horses carried them onward. At intervals he inquired after her comfort, offering a travel blanket, a small flask of water, a book that lay upon the seat. Each gesture was courteous, distant, and measured, yet Clara found herself watching him when he did not look her way, noticing the small lines at the corners of his eyes, the weariness that never quite left his face. He was a man accustomed to control, but not, perhaps, to peace. As afternoon deepened, the scenery changed. The roads narrowed, bordered by tall elms whose leaves shimmered like polished bronze in the fading light. Nathaniel stirred slightly, as if sensing her curiosity. "We are nearly there," he said. "Westmere lies beyond the next hill." Clara leaned forward, peering through the glass. When the carriage crested the rise, she caught her first glimpse of her new home. The estate spread before them like a landscape from an old painting, rolling meadows, a glimmering lake, and at the center, a grand house of pale stone that seemed to gather the last rays of the sun upon its many windows. "It is magnificent," she whispered. He inclined his head, though his expression remained unreadable. "It was built by my grandfather. Each generation has added something of its own. Now I suppose it is yours as well." The words struck her more deeply than he intended. Yours as well. They carried a strange tenderness, though spoken in a tone devoid of sentiment. When the carriage passed through the iron gates, servants appeared on the steps of the great house, lined in perfect order. At their head stood an elderly butler with silver hair and a bearing so dignified that even the breeze seemed to pause in deference. "Welcome home, Your Grace," the butler said with a deep bow. "Welcome, Your Grace," he added, turning to Clara with grave courtesy. Nathaniel introduced each principal servant by name: the housekeeper, the steward, the cook, the maid who would attend Clara. She inclined her head to each, murmuring kind words, though she could scarcely recall them. Everything around her felt too large, too polished, too still. Inside, the entrance hall rose high into shadow, lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow her as she passed. The marble floor gleamed, the scent of beeswax and lavender lingering in the air. Her footsteps echoed softly against the stone, reminding her that she was now part of something ancient and immovable. Nathaniel led her to the grand staircase. "Your chambers are prepared in the west wing," he said. "Mine are nearby should you require anything. Mrs. Whitmore, the housekeeper, will see that you are comfortable." "Thank you," she replied. The words felt small within so vast a space. He paused as though searching for more to say. "It has been some years since a mistress presided here. The household will look to you for guidance." "I shall do my best." He bowed slightly. "That is all anyone can ask." With that, he left her to the care of the waiting servants. As they led her through corridors lined with tapestries and polished doors, Clara felt the strangeness of her new title settle upon her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Duchess of Westmere, the name did not yet belong to her. It hovered, distant and unreal. When she reached her room, the windows were open to the evening air. Beyond them stretched the gardens and, farther still, the silver surface of the lake reflecting the first faint stars. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour. Clara stood alone in the quiet, listening to the echo fade. Her old life had ended in the time it took a vicar to pronounce a blessing. Before her lay a house full of silence and history, and beside her, though not yet within reach, a man she barely understood. She whispered to the darkening sky, "May I learn to belong here." Morning at Westmere Hall arrived quietly, with pale sunlight spilling through high windows and resting upon the marble floors. The house, grand and still, seemed to breathe with the rhythm of another age. Clara awoke to the faint sound of distant bells and the rustle of curtains stirred by a soft breeze. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then the sight of the canopy above her, the delicate embroidery, the shimmer of gold thread reminded her that this was no dream. She was a duchess now, though the title felt as fragile as the morning light. Her maid, Alice, entered with a curtsy. "Good morning, Your Grace. Mrs. Whitmore asks if you would like breakfast in your rooms or downstairs." "Downstairs, I think," Clara replied. "I should begin as I mean to continue." The corridors of the West Wing stretched long and echoing. Every painting and every vase seemed chosen to impress rather than to comfort. Clara descended the grand staircase, her steps careful, her hand light upon the rail. In the dining room, Nathaniel was already seated at the head of the table, a newspaper folded beside his plate. He rose at once when she entered. "Good morning, Clara," he said, his tone polite, almost formal. "Good morning, Nathaniel." They exchanged brief remarks about the weather, the journey, the estate. There was courtesy in his manner, but also distance, as though invisible walls surrounded him. He asked if she had slept well. She answered that she had. Then silence settled again, filled only by the quiet clink of silver upon porcelain. After breakfast, he spoke. "Mrs. Whitmore will show you through the house. It is a large place, and it would be best if you learn its ways before society decides to pay its visits. I would like that very much, Clara said. The tour began in the East Gallery, where portraits of past dukes and duchesses lined the walls. The faces stared out with a kind of proud melancholy, their eyes following her progress as she walked. "This one," said Mrs. Whitmore, pausing before a particular canvas, "is His Grace's mother, the late Duchess Eleanor, a kind woman, but she died young." The housekeeper's voice softened as she spoke, yet there was a reserve beneath her gentleness, a caution that Clara could not quite define. As they moved onward, Clara noticed a covered frame in the library, a large portrait hidden beneath a drape of dark cloth. "Who is that?" she asked. Mrs. Whitmore hesitated. "That is not to be disturbed, Your Grace." "Whose likeness lies beneath it?" "The late Lady Eliza Fairmont," came the careful reply. "His Grace's former fiancée." Clara stood very still. The name had been whispered in London, with the half-pitying tone society reserved for tragedies that touched its own. "Why is her portrait covered?" "It was His Grace's wish. He ordered it so after she died." "Died?" Clara repeated softly, as though the word itself carried weight. "Yes," said Mrs. Whitmore, lowering her eyes. 3 years ago, at the lake on the estate. An accident, though some say she went there by choice." Clara felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. "I see," she murmured. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. That will be all for now." When she was alone, she approached the shrouded painting. Dust had gathered upon the cloth, dulling its color. She reached out, but stopped before touching it. It felt almost indecent to uncover another woman's image, especially one who had once been promised to the man she now called husband. Yet the silence of the room pressed upon her, urging her to look. Her fingers had barely brushed the fabric when a voice spoke behind her. "I asked that it remain covered." She turned swiftly. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, his expression composed but his eyes shadowed. "I did not mean to intrude," she said quickly. He crossed the threshold and stopped beside her. "There are memories best left untouched." Clara inclined her head. "Of course." For a long moment neither spoke. Then he said, more softly, "I should have warned you. The servants mean well, but they will talk. I prefer not to dwell on what cannot be changed." "I understand," she said. "I know something of loss myself." He looked at her then, truly looked, and for a heartbeat the mask of reserve slipped. "You are kinder than I deserve," he said quietly. Then, as if the admission had startled him, he turned away. "If you have need of anything, you may send word through Mrs. Whitmore." After he left, Clara stood before the covered portrait once more. The air in the library felt heavier now, thick with unsaid things. She lowered her hand slowly, unwilling to disturb the silence he had built around himself. That evening she dined alone. He sent word that business detained him. The servants moved with quiet efficiency, their faces unreadable. When the last plate had been cleared, Clara wandered through the drawing room and paused by the pianoforte. Her mother had taught her to play as a child, though she had not touched an instrument in years. She sat down and allowed her fingers to drift over the keys. A simple melody rose, hesitant at first, then surer, echoing softly through the high ceilings. As the final note faded, she thought she heard another sound, the faint creak of a door, the whisper of footsteps retreating down the corridor. Someone had been listening. She felt it in her bones, a presence both near and unseen. Later, in her chamber, she stood at the window overlooking the lake. The water shone silver beneath the moon, calm and perfect, betraying nothing of the story it held. She shivered, though the night was mild. Somewhere within these walls the past still lingered, and she had stepped unknowingly into its shadow. She whispered to the reflection of the moon, "Whatever sorrow this house remembers, I will not let it consume me." The days that followed passed with quiet steadiness. The great house began to reveal its rhythm, a pattern of sounds and silences that Clara soon learned to recognize: the distant strike of the clock in the hall, the faint rush of wind through the old chimneys, the subdued murmur of servants whose lives moved in disciplined harmony. She rose early, preferring to walk through the gardens before the household stirred. The air smelled of damp earth and early roses, and the lake shone like polished glass beneath the morning sky. Each day she greeted the gardeners, remembered their names, and asked after their work. The first time she did so, surprise flickered across their faces, as if kindness from a duchess were a thing long forgotten. Gradually the household began to warm to her. Mrs. Whitmore, though dignified and reserved, began to speak more freely. Alice, her maid, confided small bits of gossip, nothing cruel, only the harmless sort that filled the long hours of service. Even the butler, Mr. Harding, whose manner had been carved from stone, once permitted himself a faint smile when Clara praised the order of the house. Nathaniel, however, remained distant. He spent his mornings in the study with his steward, attending to letters and estate accounts. In the afternoons, he rode across the property, inspecting the farms and tenants. Sometimes Clara glimpsed him from the window, his tall figure astride a dark horse, moving with quiet command through the fields. Always alone, always apart. In the evenings they dined together, a formality neither could quite escape. Conversation remained courteous, often confined to the weather, estate matters, or London's endless appetite for rumour. Yet there were moments when the distance between them thinned brief exchanges of shared thought, a flash of humour that neither had expected. One evening, as the servants withdrew after the final course, Nathaniel said, "You have managed the household well, Mrs. Whitmore speaks highly of your judgment." "I have done little more than listen," Clara replied. "People manage best when they are heard." He studied her, as if testing the truth of her words. "Perhaps," he said, "I have been too long out of practice in that art." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was a stillness that invited reflection rather than fear. Clara glanced at him, noticing for the first time how weariness softened the line of his mouth, how the candlelight caught the faint silver at his temples. He was not so unyielding as she had once thought. He was a man shaped by solitude. After dinner, he surprised her by asking, "Do you play? At the pianoforte?" "A little. My mother taught me." "Then you must," he said simply. "It would be pleasant to hear music in these rooms again." Quote. That night, Clara sat at the instrument in the drawing-room. Her fingers trembled as they found the keys, then steadied as the melody unfolded. It was a gentle tune, one she remembered from childhood, neither grand nor melancholy. When she finished, the final note hung in the air like a sigh. "Beautiful," Nathaniel said quietly. His voice carried a sincerity that startled her. "I had forgotten how sound can change the shape of silence." "I hope I have not disturbed you," she said. "Not at all. It is a rare gift, to bring peace into a place that has known so little of it." After that evening, a subtle change began between them. Nathaniel no longer avoided her company. He invited her to walk with him in the gardens, to visit the tenants, to review the household accounts together. He seemed to value her calm judgment, her ability to see what others overlooked. Clara, for her part, found in him a depth she had not expected a man capable of compassion, though he hid it beneath formality. One afternoon, while they rode together to a neighbouring village, a sudden summer shower swept across the fields. They took shelter beneath an oak tree, the rain drumming softly on the leaves above. "I had forgotten," Nathaniel said, watching the rain fall, "how quickly storms pass in this country. In the city they linger, heavy and grey." "Comsant." "Perhaps it is because the air is cleaner here," Clara replied. "Things are allowed to move on." He turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You make everything sound simple." "Not simple," she said. "Only possible." When the rain eased, they rode back in companionable quiet. It was the first time she had seen him smile without restraint. Later that evening, as they shared tea before the fire, Clara dared to ask, "Do you never tire of solitude, Nathaniel?" He hesitated, then said, "It is safer to keep company with one's own thoughts, and yet thoughts can be the harshest company," she said gently. For a moment, something in his eyes softened. "You may be right," he admitted, "but solitude has its uses. It asks nothing, betrays nothing, until it becomes a cage," she murmured. He looked at her then, the flicker of the fire mirrored in his gaze. "Perhaps you will show me the way out, Clara." "I can only open the door," she said. "You must choose to walk through it." He said nothing more, but the corner of his mouth lifted in quiet acknowledgement. That night, when Clara returned to her chamber, she felt a strange warmth in her chest, a fragile hope that perhaps, in time, affection might grow between them. Yet as she lay down to sleep, a sound reached her from the far end of the corridor, the faint echo of a melody, the same tune she had played earlier, carried on the wind as if from another room. She rose and opened her door, but the hall was empty. The house had returned to its silence. Only the distant sigh of the night breeze lingered, like a voice remembering something it could not forget. Summer settled softly over Westmere. The gardens bloomed in colour, the air rich with the scent of lavender and roses, and the lake shone like glass beneath the long evenings. Clara had begun to think the house was learning to breathe again. The servants moved with less caution, laughter occasionally drifted from the kitchens, and even Nathaniel seemed at ease. Their walks had become longer, their dinners less formal. It was a fragile peace, but it was peace nonetheless. One afternoon, as Clara arranged fresh flowers in the drawing room, the sound of carriage wheels broke the quiet rhythm of the day. Through the tall windows, she saw a gleaming coach drawn by two chestnut horses turn up the drive. Its panels were painted black and silver, the crest upon the door unfamiliar. The servants hurried to their places, and Mrs. Whitmore entered, her expression uneasy. "Your Grace," she said, "a visitor has arrived, Lady Verena Darcy. She claims acquaintance with His Grace and asks to be received." The name was not one Clara knew, but something in the housekeeper's tone made her pulse quicken. "Is His Grace expecting her?" "I do not believe so, Your Grace." Moments later, the drawing-room door opened, and Nathaniel appeared. His face, usually composed, betrayed a flicker of surprise before he masked it. "Lady Verena," he said under his breath, almost as though the name were a memory half unwanted. The woman who followed the butler into the room was strikingly beautiful. She moved with the assurance of someone accustomed to admiration. Her gown of deep blue satin shimmered as she walked, and her eyes, clear and sharp as polished steel, missed nothing. "Nathaniel," she said with a dazzling smile, "you have grown even more impossible to find. I thought I must travel to the ends of England to see you again." "Verena," he said, inclining his head, "this is unexpected. That, and yet delightful, surely." Her gaze shifted to Clara, coolly assessing before it softened into a practiced warmth. "And this must be the new Duchess of Westmere. How very enchanting to meet you, my dear." Clara returned the courtesy with grace. "Lady Verena, you honor our home with your visit." "Do not call it a visit," Verena said lightly, removing her gloves. "I am passing through on my way to Somerset, and could not resist calling on an old friend. I do hope you will forgive my intrusion." "Of course," Nathaniel said, though his tone was measured. "You will stay the night, naturally, only if I may not impose." She smiled again, the sort of smile that expected compliance. That evening at dinner, the harmony that Clara and Nathaniel had so carefully built began to waver. Verena dominated the conversation effortlessly. She spoke of London with sharp wit, of mutual acquaintances, of music, and of scandals recounted as though they were amusing stories. Clara listened politely, but felt the undercurrent beneath each word an intimacy, a familiarity that placed her quietly aside. "You remember, Nathaniel," Verena said with a laugh, "that dreadful musicale at Lady Granby's, when your patience gave out halfway through, and you feigned an urgent summons from Parliament to escape. You have not changed, Crew." Nathaniel's lips curved faintly. "I see you remember it well." "How could I forget?" Verena's eyes glinted. "You were my savior that evening." Clara smiled, but her fingers tightened around her glass. She felt no jealousy, only a strange unease. The woman's beauty was undeniable, her charm effortless. Yet beneath the lightness, something cold stirred a deliberate testing of boundaries, a curiosity about what power she still held. When dinner ended and they moved to the drawing room, Verena praised every detail of the house, her admiration threaded with subtle claims of familiarity. "This room," she said, tracing her gloved fingers along the pianoforte, "I remember it well. It was here, was it not, that dear Eliza used to play?" Nathaniel's expression changed, almost imperceptibly. "It was," he said quietly. "Ah, poor Eliza," Verena sighed, her tone theatrical. "She was so delicate, so sensitive. I could never quite believe her death was an accident, but I suppose such thoughts are better left buried." The words fell into the silence like a stone. Clara felt the air thicken around them. Nathaniel set down his glass carefully. "Some memories, Lady Verena," he said, "are not suited for conversation." Verena lowered her lashes in mock contrition. "Forgive me, I did not mean to distress you." Gumsin. Later, when the evening ended and their guest had retired, Clara found Nathaniel alone in the library. The fire burned low, its light throwing shadows across his face. "She spoke carelessly," Clara said softly. "She always does," he replied without looking up. "She knew Lady Eliza?" "Verena is her cousin," Nathaniel said. His tone was flat, final. "They were close once. Before," he stopped as though the rest of the sentence cost too much to speak. "You must not mind her. She enjoys stirring the past. It gives her life color." Clara wanted to ask more, but the weariness in his voice stopped her. "Then I shall not mind her," she said. He looked at her then, his eyes shadowed but grateful. "You are wiser than most, Clara. I wish I had known you sooner." That night, as she prepared for bed, Alice whispered that Lady Verena had been heard speaking with Mrs. Whitmore, asking many questions about the late Lady Eliza and about the new Duchess herself. Clara smiled faintly and said only, "Curiosity is natural in guests." But when she was alone, she could not shake the feeling that Verina's visit was not a passing whim. Before sleep claimed her, she thought of Nathaniel's face at dinner, how controlled it had been, how his hand had tightened around his glass when Verina spoke the name Eliza. The calm of the past weeks had been a fragile glass, and with one careless gesture, Lady Verena Darcy had set a crack through its surface. The next morning dawned bright, but the light that filled the corridors of Westmere Hall seemed colder than before. Lady Verena's laughter echoed faintly from the breakfast room, sharp as the clink of crystal against porcelain. Clara entered with composed grace, greeting her guest and Nathaniel with quiet civility. Yet she could feel something beneath the surface, a tension too delicate to name. Verena poured herself tea with studied ease. "I trust you slept well, Duchess?" she asked sweetly. "Very well, thank you," Clara replied. "Good. This house can be rather solemn, can it not? One feels as though the very walls remember too much." Nathaniel folded his newspaper, his expression unreadable. "Westmere remembers what we ask it to remember," he said. "Indeed," Verena murmured. "Though some memories are stubborn things." Clara smiled politely, but her heart tightened. It was clear that Verena's words were chosen not at random but with deliberate care. When breakfast ended, Nathaniel excused himself to meet the steward. Verena announced that she would rest before her afternoon ride. Clara, glad for solitude, wandered through the house in search of quiet. The library drew her as it always did. The scent of leather and old paper brought calm, and the high windows flooded the room with soft light. She traced her fingers along the spines of books she had not yet explored, histories, poetry, treatises in French and Latin. Near the great fireplace, she noticed a low cabinet half hidden behind an armchair. Its key hung forgotten in the lock. She hesitated. Curiosity was a dangerous habit, yet the cabinet seemed out of place among the orderly shelves. She knelt, turned the key, and opened the door. Inside lay a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and beneath them, a small leather-bound book, its cover worn smooth with use. She drew it out and saw the initials E.F. embossed faintly on the corner, Eliza Fairmont. For a long moment, she simply held it, her pulse quickening. The sensible part of her urged restraint, but another part, a quiet, persistent voice whispered that truth was not disrespect, that understanding could not harm the dead. She opened the book. The handwriting inside was elegant, delicate, and slightly slanted. The first entry spoke of ordinary days, garden walks, visits to neighbors, dinners with Nathaniel. There were affectionate descriptions of the estate, of the lake at sunset, of music played in the evening. Yet as Clara read further, a different tone emerged, restless, uncertain. "He is kind, yet I feel his kindness like a wall rather than an embrace. Sometimes I think he loves only the idea of peace, not the person beside him. There is another who looks at me differently, who sees the woman I might have been." Clara's breath caught. She turned the page. The entries grew shorter, sharper. "I cannot bear the stillness of this house. He is away again, as always. Henry says he will take me away one day. I half believe him. Henry." The name repeated several times, always in hurried lines, always with a trace of guilt. The final pages were stained as though by water. The last entry read simply, "If I go to the lake tonight, perhaps I will find clarity. Nathaniel will not miss me until morning." The words blurred before Clara's eyes. She closed the journal with shaking hands. The room felt colder, the air heavier. So the whispers were true. Eliza had not been the tragic angel of rumor, but a woman torn by restlessness and forbidden attachment. A floorboard creaked behind her. She turned quickly. Lady Verena stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, her expression smooth as glass. "How curious," Verena said softly. "I did not take you for the inquisitive sort, Duchess." "I was not searching for anything," Clara said, rising. "I found this by chance." "List." "By chance?" Verena's gaze drifted to the journal in Clara's hand. "My poor cousin's words. I imagine they make distressing reading." "They are private," Clara replied. "I shall return them where I found them." "Private?" Verena repeated, stepping closer. "Nothing in this house is private, my dear. Not truly. Westmere keeps its secrets, but it does not forgive them. You would do well to remember that." Her smile did not reach her eyes. With graceful ease, she turned and left the room, the echo of her footsteps fading down the corridor. Clara remained motionless for a long while. Then she replaced the journal in the cabinet, locked it, and slipped the key into her pocket. Whatever game Verena was playing, it was not one she intended to lose. That evening at dinner, Verena's manner was all charm once more. She told amusing stories from London, praised the wine, laughed easily. Yet, whenever Nathaniel spoke, she watched him too closely, her gaze lingering with an intimacy that seemed designed to wound. Clara responded with perfect composure, though beneath the calm her mind turned restlessly. When the meal ended and Verena retired, Nathaniel paused by the fire. "You are quiet tonight," he said. "Your guest has given me much to think about. She has that effect on everyone. Pay her no heed. She thrives on unease." Clara looked into the flames. Then it would be wise not to give her any. He regarded her for a moment, a faint smile touching his lips. "I see you understand her better than most." When he left her to the quiet of the drawing room, Clara remained before the fire until the embers dimmed. She thought of the journal, of the final desperate words written by a woman lost between duty and desire. And she thought of Nathaniel, of the loneliness she had glimpsed in him, the same loneliness that had driven Eliza toward ruin. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the windows. Clara whispered to the darkened room, "I will not let history repeat itself." The next day broke with a restless wind sweeping over the fields. Clouds gathered above Westmere Hall, heavy and low, as though the sky itself had grown weary of silence. Inside, the house was subdued. Lady Verena announced that she would depart before nightfall, claiming a prior engagement in Somerset. Nathaniel expressed polite regret. Clara merely inclined her head. It was clear to them both that Verena's visit had accomplished something more than polite disruption. The air she left behind was charged, uncertain, waiting. By late afternoon, the first drops of rain began to fall. Clara stood at the window of the library, watching the ripples spread across the surface of the lake. Her reflection stared back at her, pale against the darkening glass. She thought of Eliza's final words, "Perhaps I will find clarity." That same lake had swallowed another woman's doubts 3 years ago. Clara felt the weight of that history pressing upon her. Nathaniel entered quietly. "You are watching the storm," he said. "I was thinking of the calm that comes after," she replied without turning. "Does it comfort you?" "It does not frighten me," she said. "Perhaps that is comfort enough." He joined her at the window, his presence filling the space beside her. "Verena has gone," he said after a pause. "I regret that her visit caused you distress." "It was not distressing," she answered. "Only revealing." He looked at her sharply. "Revealing? She told me that the portrait in the library belonged to Lady Eliza, your former fiancée. I already knew. What I did not know was the rest." His expression changed, tightening. "The rest?" Clara turned to face him. "That she did not die by accident, that she was in love with another man, that she left words behind which tell a different story from the one society believes." For a long moment he said nothing. The rain intensified, tapping against the glass like fingers. "You have read her journal," he said at last, his voice low. "Yes." He walked away from the window, his steps measured, his shoulders rigid. Those pages were never meant to be found. Yet they were. Would you rather ignorance endure than truth be known? "I would rather the dead rest in peace." Code. Clara followed him, her heart pounding. "Peace built on falsehood is not peace, Nathaniel. You have carried guilt that is not yours." He stopped at the hearth, staring into the flames. "You presume much, Duchess." "I presume what any wife must when she sees her husband haunted by something he cannot name." The title on her lips, wife, seemed to shake him. He turned sharply, and for the first time she saw anger in his eyes, not coldness but raw pain. "You think you understand," he said. "You know nothing of what happened. She was fragile, impulsive. I should have seen it. I should have stopped her. Instead, I let her walk to the lake that night, believing time would calm her. I was wrong. She drowned, and with her went any claim I had to peace. She went to meet another man," Clara said softly. "You could not have stopped what she had already chosen." He stared at her, disbelief giving way to something like anguish. "Who told you that?" "She did. In her own hand." Quote. He turned away, pressing a hand to his brow. "Then the world is crueler than I imagined. To mourn a lie for 3 years." He broke off, his voice roughened. "Why would you tell me this?" "Because truth does not wound. It cleanses. You have punished yourself for too long." The fire flickered, casting unsteady light across his face. "And what would you have me do, Clara? Forget her? Forget the whispers, the pity, the eyes that follow me as though I carry death wherever I go?" "No," she said, stepping closer. "I would have you forgive yourself. That is all she ever denied you." Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, and the rain came down in sudden torrents. Nathaniel turned toward the window, then toward her again, as though searching for something solid to hold. "You speak as if forgiveness were simple," he said. "It is not simple," she answered, "but it is possible." The words hung between them, fragile as breath. Then he moved, crossing the space between them with sudden urgency. "Why do you care so much?" he demanded. "Because I know what it is to live without peace," she whispered. The storm burst overhead. A gust of wind flung the window open, scattering the curtains like white wings. Rain swept into the room, cool and sharp against their faces. Clara did not step back. Nathaniel reached to close the window, then stopped, his hand still upon the frame, his eyes locked on hers. "You should not have come into this house," he said hoarsely. "It was meant to remain asleep. Then perhaps it is time it woke." He let the window fall shut, the rain drumming against the glass. Slowly, as if drawn by a force beyond either of them, he reached out and touched her hand. The gesture was hesitant, questioning. When she did not withdraw, his fingers tightened. "I do not know how to be the man you seem to believe I am," he said. "You already are," she murmured. Something within him broke then, not in despair, but in release. He drew her to him, his other hand lifting to her face, and kissed her with the tenderness of a man long starved of warmth. The sound of rain filled the room, drowning the world beyond. For a moment, they were simply two souls who had found each other in the wreckage of their own restraint. When he drew back, his forehead rested against hers. "You will think me foolish," he said. "I think you human," she answered. They stood that way until the thunder passed, and only the soft patter of rain remained. Nathaniel's hand still held hers, and for the first time since she had entered this house, Clara felt that the silence between them had changed its shape. It was no longer a wall, it was a shelter. Outside, the lake rippled under the clearing sky, its surface reflecting the faint glow of returning light. Inside, two hearts had learned at last to breathe the same air. In the days that followed the storm, Westmere Hall changed in ways so subtle that only those who had lived within its walls could sense them. The servants spoke more softly, as if the air itself had grown gentler. The heavy tension that once filled the room seemed to lift, leaving behind a calm expectancy. Nathaniel and Clara moved through the house with an ease that neither had known before. Their dinners were no longer silent affairs. Sometimes they lingered over tea, sharing quiet laughter that startled the butler so much he once forgot to announce dessert. Nathaniel, once elusive, began to speak of his plans for the estate repairs to the tenants' cottages, new schools for the children, better roads through the villages. He asked for her opinion and, when she gave it, listened with real attention. On mild mornings, they rode together across the fields. On cooler days, they read by the fire, each absorbed in a different book, but content in the shared silence. The fragile peace that had begun in the storm now deepened into something warmer. Though neither spoke of love, it was present in small gestures, the way his hand lingered on hers when passing a cup, the way her gaze softened when she found him waiting at the foot of the stairs. Yet happiness in this world seldom passes unobserved. One morning, while Clara was arranging letters on the writing desk in her sitting room, the butler entered carrying a silver tray. "A packet has arrived from London, Your Grace," he said, "brought by the morning coach." Quote, she thanked him and broke the seal. The letter was from her sister Marianne, written in a hand as elegant as her conversation. Clara smiled as she read the first lines of cheerful domestic news, but as her eyes moved downward, the words grew darker. "My dearest Clara, it pains me to tell you what is being said here in town, but I cannot allow you to be unprepared. Lady Verena Darcy has been most vocal in certain circles, insisting that your marriage to the Duke of Westmere was arranged from necessity rather than affection. She even hints that you were forced into it to conceal your father's debts. Forgive me for repeating such cruelty, but the talk has spread beyond drawing rooms. It is whispered at Almack's and repeated at every supper table. Some say the Duke still mourns his former love, and that you serve merely as a convenient shield. I know this cannot be true, yet I fear gossip once born cannot be silenced easily." The letter slipped from Clara's hand. For a long time she sat motionless, the words burning in her mind. The old life she had left behind, the polite society that judged without mercy, had found its way to her quiet refuge. When Nathaniel entered later, he found her still at the desk, pale and thoughtful. "Clara," he said gently, "what troubles you?" She hesitated, then handed him the letter. He read it in silence, his expression hardening with each line. When he finished, he folded the paper with deliberate care and placed it upon the desk. "So it begins again," he said. "Verena, who else?" His voice was controlled, but beneath it lay anger sharpened by weariness. She has always known how to wield words like weapons. It is her favorite art. She cannot harm us, Clara said quietly, though her heart trembled. She can wound reputation, and reputation is the only currency society understands, he replied. But she will not have the last word. He crossed to the window, staring out at the gardens where autumn had begun to gild the leaves. I had hoped to spare you this, he said, to keep our peace untouched by that world. I would rather face truth than live behind closed doors, she said. We cannot hide forever. He turned back to her, his expression softening. No, we cannot. Then we shall face it together. That evening, he summoned the steward to make arrangements for a journey. We will return to London within the fortnight, he said. It is time society learned that our marriage needs no defense. When he told Clara of his decision, she felt both dread and relief. You would confront them all? I would live openly, he answered. There is power in showing the truth rather than speaking it. Quote, as preparations began, Clara sensed a quiet strength in him that stirred both pride and affection. The man who had once hidden behind solitude now stood ready to meet the world. She realized how deeply he had changed and how deeply she had come to care for him. On the evening before their departure, they walked once more by the lake. The air was crisp, the first hints of autumn mist rising from the water. Nathaniel stopped and looked out over the still surface. For years, he said, this lake has been nothing but a grave to me, but now I see it differently. It reflects light, even after the storm. Clara slipped her arm through his. Then it has learned from you, she said. He smiled faintly. Perhaps from us both. They stood together as twilight gathered, two figures outlined against the fading light. Beyond the lake, the first stars began to appear. Clara thought of London waiting beyond the horizon, its bright rooms, its sharp tongues, its endless appetite for stories. But she no longer feared it. The world could whisper as it pleased. What mattered was the truth they had found between them. The next morning, the carriages were loaded, the servants assembled, and the Duke and Duchess of Westmere prepared to leave the quiet safety of their estate. As the gates closed behind them, the house seemed to watch in silence, its windows glinting like patient eyes. Neither spoke during the first hour of travel. Nathaniel's hand rested loosely upon hers, a wordless promise that whatever awaited them, they would face it side by side. Outside, the road stretched toward London, winding through gold and green fields. Behind them, Westmere lay bathed in pale light, a memory and a promise both. Ahead lay the noise of the world and the proof their hearts had yet to give. London greeted them with the same restless energy it had always possessed, the clatter of carriages, the flicker of lamplight upon rain-dark streets, and the ceaseless murmur of voices hungry for novelty. For the Duke and Duchess of Westmere, it was a return not to home but to a stage upon which every glance carried meaning. Their townhouse on Grosvenor Square had been shuttered for nearly a year. When the servants threw open its doors, the air smelled faintly of dust and lavender, a scent of waiting. Clara moved through the rooms with quiet wonder. It was elegant but less severe than Westmere Hall, its mirrors reflecting warmth rather than shadow. Nathaniel watched her as she traced her hand along the polished banister. This house has missed its mistress, he said. I have hardly earned the title, she answered softly. You have earned more than that, he replied, though he said it almost to himself. Within days, word spread through the city that the elusive Duke and his new Duchess had returned. Invitations began to arrive, first in cautious trickles, then in torrents. Clara saw the familiar names Lady Jersey, the Countess of Harrowden, the Marchioness of Whitby, and knew that each card carried curiosity disguised as courtesy. The first engagement was a musical evening at Lady Jersey's. Clara had never been nervous of company, but that night as she dressed, she felt her hands tremble. They will be watching, she said to Nathaniel. Let them, he replied calmly. They will see what they choose, but we will know the truth. The ballroom glowed with hundreds of candles reflected in tall mirrors. Conversation hushed when they entered. For a moment the crowd seemed to pause, a living wave of eyes and whispers. Then, as etiquette demanded, the hostess swept forward with a smile that concealed more questions than it answered. Your Grace, Lady Jersey said to Nathaniel, how delightful to see you return to society. And this must be your Duchess. We have all been so eager to make her acquaintance. Clara curtsied, her composure perfect. Your ladyship is most kind. Kindness, Lady Jersey murmured, is the least one can offer to a woman who has managed to capture such a man. Cly. The words were compliment and challenge both. Clara met them with serenity. I did not capture him, she said gently. We simply found that our paths led the same way. A murmur spread through those nearest enough to hear. Even Lady Jersey's sharp eyes softened with interest. "How very refreshing," she said. For the remainder of the evening, Nathaniel remained at Clara's side. He introduced her to his acquaintances with calm pride, his manner making it impossible to doubt his affection. When conversation turned to their marriage, he spoke with quiet conviction of her grace, her intellect, her influence upon his household. The listening guests, who had expected awkwardness or distance, found none. As they moved through the rooms, Clara caught sight of Lady Verena near the refreshment table. The woman's beauty was as polished as ever, but there was a tautness about her smile, a trace of effort beneath the elegance. When their eyes met, Verena inclined her head with languid civility. "Duchess," she said, her voice like silk drawn over steel, "London is all astonishment at your transformation. You appear quite at ease in your new rank." "I am learning," Clara said pleasantly, "but I find sincerity requires less effort than pretense." A faint color rose in Verena's cheeks. "How fortunate that you have such an experienced teacher." Nathaniel's voice cut gently between them. "Lady Verena," he said, "your concern for my wife's education does you credit, but I assure you she manages admirably without instruction." Verena's smile tightened. "How gallant of you to say so." "Gallantry," he said evenly, "is unnecessary when truth suffices." The brief silence that followed seemed to ripple outward through the crowd. Verena's eyes flashed, but she inclined her head and turned away. Clara exhaled quietly. "You did not need to defend me," she whispered. "I did not defend," he answered. "I spoke what everyone should already know." Later that evening, as the orchestra played a waltz, Nathaniel offered his hand. "One dance, Clara." "You do not usually dance," she said. "I do tonight." When they stepped onto the floor, the whispers began again, but softer this time, tinged with admiration rather than doubt. The Duke of Westmere, long known for his aloofness, now moved with his wife as though she were the only person in the room. The music swelled, and the crowd parted to watch. Clara felt the world fade away, until there was only the rhythm of his hand guiding hers, the steady warmth of his gaze, and the unspoken understanding that had grown between them. When the dance ended, he did what no one expected. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it in full view of the assembly. A collective murmur swept through the room, followed by applause that began hesitantly and grew into genuine approval. The shift was unmistakable. Society had witnessed what no rumor could deny, devotion made visible. As they left the ballroom, Lady Jersey intercepted them once more, her manner gracious. "Your Grace," she said to Clara, "it seems I was mistaken. Some matches are indeed made in heaven after all." Outside, the night air was cool and fragrant. Nathaniel helped Clara into the carriage. "It is done," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied, her smile gentle, "and not for them, but for us. Go." As the carriage rolled through the lamplit streets, she leaned her head against his shoulder. The city around them hummed with life, but within that small space there was only the steady rhythm of two hearts, learning to beat together. When the London season ended, the journey back to Westmere felt different from the one that had taken them away. The roads were lined with fallen leaves, and the first breath of winter carried the faint scent of wood smoke. Clara watched the countryside unfold with quiet contentment, her gloved hand resting lightly in Nathaniel's. The silence between them was no longer restraint. It was comfort. Westmere Hall appeared at last through the mist, its pale stone softened by the low light of the afternoon Sunday. As the carriage rolled through the gates, Clara felt a sense of homecoming that surprised her. The great house no longer seemed cold. The windows glowed with welcome, and when the servants gathered to greet them, their smiles were unguarded. Mrs. Whitmore curtsied deeply. "Welcome home, Your Graces. We have missed you." "It is good to be back," Clara said sincerely. That evening, the fire burned bright in the drawing room. Nathaniel stood by the hearth, one hand resting on the mantel, watching the flames. Clara entered quietly, her gown of soft grey silk, whispering over the carpet. He turned when he heard her step, and smiled a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I had forgotten how beautiful this room looks when it is lived in," he said. "It waited for you," she answered. "For us," he corrected gently. She sat near the fire, and for a while they spoke of simple things, the tenants' harvest, the school project they hoped to begin, the new rose garden planned for spring. The warmth between them deepened, not through grand declarations, but through the ease of shared purpose. Later, Nathaniel poured her a glass of wine and handed it to her with deliberate care. "You have changed this place," he said. "When you came, the house was asleep. Now it feels alive again." "It was never the house that needed waking," she said softly. "Then I owe you a debt I can never repay." "There is no debt between us, Nathaniel." He set down his glass, his expression thoughtful. "There is one promise I would make, if you will allow it." "What promise?" "That we never again let silence stand between us as a wall. I cannot undo the years that came before, but I can promise you this: whatever time remains to us will be lived in honesty." Her eyes met his, calm and luminous in the firelight. "Then I accept your promise," she said, "and I make one of my own that this house will never again feel lonely, so long as I live within it. Kodozai." Outside, snow began to fall, soft and soundless. Nathaniel drew the curtains aside and watched the flakes drift against the dark glass. "It seems winter has come early," he murmured. "Winter brings peace," Clara said, "and sometimes renewal." He turned back to her, something unspoken in his gaze. Then he crossed the room, opened a small box that rested upon the mantel, and held it out to her. Inside lay a necklace of sapphires and diamonds, deep blue stones that caught the firelight and scattered it like frozen stars. "This was made for my grandmother," he said. "She wore it at her wedding. It has waited in the family vault for years. I would have you wear it now, not as a symbol of rank, but of what you have given back to this house and to me." Clara's breath caught. "It is too fine," she whispered. "It is not enough," he replied. "Nothing could be." Quote. He fastened the necklace around her throat, his fingers brushing her skin. The touch lingered, tender and deliberate. "There," he said softly. "Perfect." When she looked up, he was still watching her, his expression unreadable but full of quiet emotion. "You once told me," he said, "that peace built upon falsehood is no peace at all. You were right. I thought contentment was enough, but I was mistaken." She reached for his hand. "And what have you found instead?" "Something rarer, something that frightens me and steadies me in equal measure." "Love," she said simply. He nodded. "If that is what it is, then yes, love." The words hung in the stillness like the clear tone of a bell. No music followed, no applause, only the soft crackle of the fire and the quiet falling of snow outside. Nathaniel drew her close, his forehead resting against hers. "I cannot promise the world's approval," he said, "but I can promise you my heart, without condition." Quote, "And I promise mine," she answered. The rest of the night passed in quiet joy. They spoke of the future, of spring plantings, of charitable works, of the school that would bear her name. The plans were practical, but beneath them ran the current of something stronger, the shared certainty that love, once awakened, could make even the coldest walls warm. Before retiring, Nathaniel poured 2 glasses of champagne. "To Westmere," he said. "To new beginnings," she replied. They drank, and outside the snow deepened. In the hush that followed, the house seemed to sigh, as if releasing the last ghosts of its grief. When Clara went to her chamber, she paused at the window to look out at the whitened gardens. The moon hung low, silver upon the snow, and for the first time she saw the lake without dread. It reflected the sky like a mirror of forgiveness. She pressed a hand to her heart and whispered, "Thank you." Though so, somewhere in the corridor, she heard Nathaniel's step approaching. When he entered, she turned to him with a smile. There were no words left to say, only understanding, quiet and complete. Outside, the storm continued, but within Westmere Hall, winter had brought its promise. A year passed quietly at Westmere Hall. The seasons moved in gentle procession, spring with its soft rains and wildflowers, summer heavy with warmth and bees, autumn strewing gold upon the fields, and now winter had returned once more. The house stood serene amid its gardens, its windows glowing against the pale expanse of snow. Within, the great hall was filled with the scent of pine and the sound of laughter. A fire burned bright upon the hearth. Servants moved with cheerful ease, carrying wreaths and candles, preparing for the Christmas Eve gathering that Clara had begun only that year. What had once been a place of silence had become a home of voices, of life restored. Clara sat by the nursery window, watching the snow drift gently past. In her lap lay a small blanket she was sewing, its delicate stitches forming tiny blue flowers. The quiet rhythm of needle and thread soothed her. When she felt the faint flutter within her, she smiled. The child had begun to move more often now, gentle reminders that life was waiting just beneath her heart. Nathaniel entered softly, his boots leaving faint prints upon the carpet. He paused at the doorway, watching her for a moment before speaking. "You should rest," he said. "Mrs. Whitmore will scold me if I allow you to tire yourself." "I am not tired," she answered, still smiling. "He seems to have more energy than I do." Or she, Nathaniel said. You have already decided? No, she replied. I think I prefer to be surprised. He came to stand beside her, gazing out at the snow-covered grounds. Do you remember our first winter here? He asked quietly. How could I forget? It was the loneliest season of my life, he said, and now it is the most peaceful. She reached for his hand. Peace does not come to those who hide from it. You taught me that. He smiled faintly. I think we taught each other. Coke. They stood together in the soft light, the steady glow of the fire behind them, and the white world before. Outside, the lake lay frozen, a mirror of ice reflecting the pale afternoon Sunday. It no longer carried the shadow of tragedy. It had become instead a symbol of endurance, of beauty found even in stillness. As evening deepened, the bells from the village church drifted through the cold air, faint but clear. Clara rose and went to the mantel, where a small collection of Christmas cards and letters stood in neat rows. Among them was one from her sister Marianne, written in a hand both elegant and affectionate. It spoke of her children, of her joy at hearing that Clara's household was thriving, of gratitude that the old debts of the Everleigh name had finally been erased. Clara read the words with quiet satisfaction. Her family, once burdened by worry and pride, now stood secure again. And though distance separated them, affection had bridged what fortune once divided. Later that night, the household gathered in the great hall for supper. The servants joined the table at Nathaniel's insistence, a tradition he claimed they would honor each year. Candles burned along the length of polished wood, their flames reflected in the silver. Clara raised her glass, her voice calm but full. To Westmere, she said, and to those who call it home. Quote. Nathaniel's eyes met hers across the table. To home, he echoed. After supper, when the others had retired, they walked together through the quiet corridors. The candles flickered along the walls, casting their shadows gently upon the floor. They paused before the library door. The portrait of Eliza still hung beneath its drape, untouched since that day. Nathaniel regarded it in silence. Will you ever remove it? Clara asked softly. He shook his head. No. The past should be remembered, but not worshipped. She belongs to it now, as peace belongs to us. Clara nodded. Then let it remain as it is. He took her hand, and together they left the room. When they reached the front steps, the night greeted them with stillness. Snow had fallen thickly, blanketing the lawns in white. Above them, the sky was clear, the stars sharp and bright as frost. Nathaniel drew her close beneath his arm, his breath forming a faint cloud in the cold air. Do you see that? He said, nodding toward the horizon. A single light shimmered faintly across the lake, the reflection of a lantern placed there by the gardener earlier that day. It glowed softly, golden against the silver ice. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. It looks like hope, she whispered. He smiled. It is hope, a light to mark the place where everything began. For a long time they stood watching it. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of pine and snow, and the faint sound of laughter drifted from the hall behind them. Nathaniel turned to her, his voice low and steady. Where once I lost my heart, he said, now I have found my home. Clara looked up at him, her eyes shining. And home is where love stays. He kissed her gently, a promise renewed beneath the stars. When they returned inside, the warmth of the fire welcomed them like an embrace. Clara paused once more at the threshold of the great hall. The light from the hearth spilled across the floor, and for an instant she thought she saw the ghosts of sorrow fade completely from the walls. Westmere Hall, once haunted by silence, now breathed with life. In her heart, she carried the certainty that peace, once found, could never again be lost. And to those who listened, who perhaps believed themselves too late for love or too far gone for forgiveness, her story would whisper a single truth through the quiet of winter, that the heart, once opened, remains forever young,